What is the root issue for that hatred towards our black brothers and sisters? The Lord woke me up kind of in the middle of the night, and He answered that question, and that answer was because they're my chosen people.
In 70 AD, General Vespasian and his son Titus put an end to Jerusalem with great slaughter. Many outrages and atrocities were committed against the remainder of the people. It has been estimated that over 1 million Hebrews fled into the interiors of Africa from Roman persecution and slavery. The slave markets were full of black Hebrew slaves.
To reconnect to your history, you need to do three things. One, you need to redefine who the children of Judah are according to the old references. Not from the 1900s to newer, because those books tend to have a totally, completely different history in those books. So you have to ask yourself, how did we lose this in history? How did you lose 400,000 people in history? And the reason why I say how did you lose 400,000 people in history is not in the books.
Many people in today's time, many Israelites who don't know their heritage or who they are looking back.
Now it is up to us to have eyes to see and ears to hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, the time has come for you to learn once and for all who you are. So-called Negro, prepare yourself for an epic discovery. This may change your life forever. Let's take a closer look at your DNA.
All right, my brother. You proved that the Jews were black using old books, artifacts, and archaeology. But tell me this, how do I know if I'm an Israelite?
previously discussed the city of Lachish, conquered by King Sennacherib of Assyria, who after conquering the tribe of Judah's city, he then depicted the tribe of Judah on a stone relief to commemorate his victory. And we note that the Assyrians depicted Judah as a woolly-headed Negro. In fact, we also reviewed Lachish's archaeological evidence, which analyzed the skulls of the sons of Judah. And we also found them to be the skulls of a woolly-headed black man. We then noted that a little over 100 years later, these sons of Judah were taken to Babylon and Spain by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Years later, the Roman general Titus also brought nobles of the tribe of Judah into Spain in 70 AD. These two events set the stage for the greatest scattering of a people group in known history. From here, we read references which describe Jews expelled from Spain and Portugal into Africa and the Americas in great numbers. We also read references which told us these same Jews were then sold into slavery and scattered around the world. Proof. The Negro. They cut off his fingers and thumbs if they caught him reading those old books. After all, those books revealed his true identity. And they couldn't have him learning that now, could they? How else could they justify his persecution, torment, and murder? By the hands of the church, by the hands of the Christians. The church openly persecuted the children of Israel. In fact, they persecuted none other than the royal house of Judah. Now, while Judah was in captivity, Judah was fed from the mouth of the great red dragon and the daughter of Babylon. You see, the daughter of Babylon taught Judah his history, a version of history which began with slavery and the west coast of Africa. This altered version of Judah's history began in 1619 with the arrival of Africans in English colonies on the east coast of what would later give rise to the United States of America. Judah's history before 1619 was simply omitted, covered over with new books containing a slightly modified history. To cover up this truth, modern-day books occasionally omit key parts of quotes which describe the Jews as Negro or Black, often by using well-placed ellipses to hide the truth. even find modern books deleting entire paragraphs, which describe the Jews as being placed on West and Central Africa in great numbers and then sold into slavery. We can also find modern books acknowledging the common understanding of Jews being black during the Middle Ages, only to propose their blackness as being metaphorical. Family. These are just some of the discrepancies found in contemporary books and reasons why you should go directly to the source and read it for yourselves. DNA of the Negro is arguably one of the most misunderstood DNA stories on Earth. You see, traditional DNA analysis rightfully trace so-called Negro DNA back to Africa. And these relationships are discovered by simply comparing present-day African American DNA with present-day African DNA. And as stated before, this analysis rightfully identifies our deep connection with our African brothers and sisters. However, there's one critical missing component in this type of DNA analysis, and it's called genetic bottleneck.
They drunk at the problems that you was on. She knows that she is the same. She's trying to stop playing games. She's in love again. They do not know what they do. They do not see that.
You see, a genetic bottleneck event occurs when a catastrophic event of such magnitude, of such destruction, that it wipes out or greatly reduces an entire population. In other words, the population gets purged. And the so-called Negro has gone through multiple purging events. These DNA impacting events could be an earthquake, which levels an entire city. It could be a megablast from a sleeping volcano, which obliterates all life within 100 square miles. Or, in the case of the so-called Negro, it could be the transatlantic slave trade. Which murdered and displaced millions of people around the world over hundreds of years. Or a genetic bottleneck event could be triggered by an expulsion edict or an inquisition, which evicted and murdered hundreds of thousands of the House of Judah in Spain and Portugal. And so these major events, which caused hundreds of thousands of people to disappear from an entire region, subsequently changed the DNA profile of the surviving population. Most importantly, these genetic bottleneck events impact DNA matches which display on modern-day DNA reports. For example, so-called Negro DNA isn't found among certain modern-day populations in great numbers. And it's because the Jews were expelled from those places. For example, today's DNA reports don't show so-called Negro DNA matches in and around present-day Israel. However, if we instead compare so-called Negro DNA to ancient DNA extracted from archaeological sites in Israel and Lebanon, we find something unexpected. We find so-called Negro DNA buried in the ground of ancient Israel before the time of the Messiah.
Why was it before the time of the so-called Messiah? Because before the time of that, we were serving the Creator only. But then we failed because we started trying to serve some so-called Messiah, who is the devil, known as Mr. J. All right? And the Creator let us know. And so all the prophets, all the real prophets, and their name was not Mr. J. And they told us the same thing. Unfortunately, our people didn't listen to the prophets, and that's how we got into this mess. We don't serve Mr. J. We obviously know he's the devil.
Beirut, Lebanon. These ancient archaeological dig sites date back as far as 800 BC. Here, archaeologists discovered the remains of multiple people who lived in ancient Lebanon. These ancient remains are assigned ID numbers and dates. In this particular archaeological site in Beirut, Lebanon, we examined one of the DNA samples collected from an ancient gravesite. DNA from this ancient individual is labeled SFI-43. This particular individual lived approximately 567 to 404 BC. Researchers compared the ancient DNA remains of SFI-43 to modern-day Lebanese and Egyptian populations, as well as samples taken from a previous report. They discovered something shocking. They discovered the ancient Lebanese labeled SFI-43 was not closely related to modern Lebanese populations. Instead, SFI-43 showed close relationship to ancient Egyptian DNA samples. This is related in the following graph. Notice the dark green dots of the ancient Egyptian DNA are close to the light green dots of the SFI-43 ancient Lebanese DNA samples. The same findings were illustrated in yet another graph. Now, in this particular graph, related or shared DNA between samples is displayed as red marks. Now notice SFI-43 shows red related marks when compared to the ancient Egyptian DNA samples. However, researchers didn't stop there. They added one additional group to compare their ancient Lebanese SFI-43 DNA to. They compared it to the E1B1A Yoruba DNA of West Africa. And they were surprised to see that it was a perfect match.
That does not take away the fact that we're over here too, as well as there. The fact is that certain parts of Africa, so-called Africa, goes all the way, did when it was all connected, went from there to here. So that will explain that, all right? And of course, I know that's when they call it Pandora. Yeah, it's Pandora. Y'all can look into that if y'all want to. You see what I'm talking about. All right? But yeah, we've been here, and yeah, we was there too. But that whole ship bullshit, throw that out the window. Every place we was at, they was coming to here. The only place we was at and the slaves we was at. The only place they really took us that we really wasn't at was Spain, because most of us left Spain. Only some stayed behind. They mixed in. They became Spanish with the Portuguese. All right, they mixed with those guys. Just had to clarify that up real quick. I think I did. That's everything. If I missed anything, just somebody add in the comment, because there's a lot of information inside this brain of mine, and sometimes I forget to say some things.
Negroes in Israel before the time of the Messiah. And it's not like we're just finding one person in these ancient sites. In research reports, we find the DNA of our African American queens, listed as L0 and L3. That's the DNA of Negroes. And it can only mean one thing. We were there. Ancient DNA which matched the Yoruba of West Africa. What is it doing in Beirut, Lebanon in 567 BC? Family. The Bible tells us life is in the blood, and they're finding your blood in these old bones of Israel. To know if your DNA matches ancient DNA discovered in Lebanon from around 567 BC? Well, if you've taken DNA tests with companies such as Ancestry DNA or 23andMe, you can download your DNA data from those companies and upload your data to mytrueancestry.com.
Now you gotta be careful with those tests, because most of the tests are bullshit. They usually tell you they try to trick you in the test a lot of times. So your best way is, honestly, ask your grandmom, your granddad, even if your mom is alive. Like, I don't know how old some of you are. I'm in my 40s, I'll say that. So if you're in your 40s, you can ask your mom, and she can tell you a whole lot of shit like my mom used to do. And of course, you can ask, if you're in your 30s, ask your grandmother. She can tell you. All right? I think if you're like 20 or like mid-20s and down, unfortunately, you're probably not gonna find much information on that from your family. What you have to do is find out what state and city they was in that they call it now, and you figure out what particular tribes were there, and you can narrow it down like that.
MyTrueAncestry.com will compare your DNA to ancient DNA extracted from archaeological sites all around the world. Now, Prices may vary based on the number of archaeological sites you wish to compare your DNA to. And no, we're not associated with my true ancestry. However, if you want to know your story, if you want to know if you're related to ancient human remains discovered in and around Israel before the time of the Messiah, then upload your DNA today. And not only might you find your literal family gravesite in Israel, you also might discover you have a family gravesite in Granada, Spain. But first, let's review how the Brews got to Spain in the first place.